When it comes to Scrum, Scrum works in complex domains where knowledge and practice is emergent. An important takeaway at this point is that Scrum doesn't apply and should not be applied to every instance of product delivery. In fact, there are many cases where trying to use Scrum will make it much harder to deliver your product. So what I'm going to do now is talk to you about when Scrum should be used and when it shouldn't be used. Note that the Scrum Guide itself describes Scrum as a lightweight framework that helps people, teams and organizations generate value through adaptive solutions to complex problems. But what is a complex problem? This idea of complexity is a loaded term. Many people could tell you what the word complex means. It means tough, it means challenging, right? But what does complex mean when we consider product delivery and in particular the Scrum framework? A good place to look for this information is the Cynefin framework. It's a framework created by a guy called Dave Snowden, and the idea is that there are 4 domains called clear, complicated, complex and chaotic, and these domains are defined by their cause and effect relationships. For example, in the clear domain, whenever you put a certain input or cause, you will get the same effect at the end of it. Now, the complicated domain is where more is known than unknown, if you consider information and knowledge. In this complicated domain, we are able to make good forecasts about what will happen if a certain cause occurs, and therefore good practices can exist. The domain we're most interested in, though, is called the complex domain, because that's where Scrum, as an empirical process, thrives. It is where more is unknown than known about the situation. And the chaotic domain, which is the furthest end of the spectrum, is where the cause and effect is impossible to determine or predict. When it comes to working within complexity, and it's worth saying now that nearly all product development exists within complexity, what you need to do is to probe for some information, sense or interpret the evidence that you've gathered, and then respond to it. The complex domain in Cynefin is often associated with those 3 words: probe, sense, and respond. Let's try a challenging activity now. I've just mentioned that there are 4 domains when it comes to Cynefin, and I want you to come up with an example for each of those 4 domains: clear, complicated, complex, and chaotic. You'll probably find it easier to consider real-world events in order to do this. It's really hard and is likely to take you a few minutes, but pause the video and take some time to think of an example of something that happens in a clear domain, where if you do one thing, you know exactly what is going to happen by doing it. Think of an example for the complicated domain, where you don't know everything, but you are able to make a good forecast of what might happen if you do a certain thing. Then think of an example for complexity, where there is a need to probe, sense, and respond, where there is more unknown than known, but you are able to decide what the next best step might be. And finally, think of an example for the chaotic domain, where a cause may occur, but you don't know anything about the effect it will have. Pause the video now. So here are my examples, and some of them might work for you, and some of them might not, and that's okay. And to be honest, you're far more likely to remember your own examples than mine anyway. When talking about the clear domain example, I use baking. If I follow a recipe, I know what I'm going to get at the end. The cause and effect is clear, simple, and understood. You aren't going to look at a recipe and ignore it because you know better. The cause and effect is clear, which is why a recipe, or perhaps a better word is a methodology, can work effectively here. When it comes to the complicated domain, the example I use is building a shed. You know what it should look like when it's done, and there are good practices for building something safely. You don't need frequent feedback because you understand the requirement and tools well. When things go wrong, you can self-correct, leading to methodologies like waterfall working well here. Just a small tip from real life. Many organizations think they understand their requirements so well that they don't need to gather feedback. In nearly all cases, they are wrong. So just bear in mind that there is a fine line between confidence and arrogance. So for me, complexity is like playing poker. You can look at your own cards until you're blue in the face, but the only thing you're going to learn is that your opponents do not have exactly the same cards as you. So what you need to do is first probe by taking an action that you can observe the impact of, sense your opponent's response, and then make an approach or an action based on your evidence. And finally, chaos. Chaos happens because there is no relationship between the cause and effect. Commonly, it is associated with crisis and emergency scenarios, or things such as support queues in retail businesses. The takeaway from this video is that Scrum thrives on complexity. Please don't try to use Scrum for simple or clear problems. It's honestly a waste of time and money, your money. Equally, don't use Scrum because your organization has told you to. Determine where your situation fits within the Cynefin model and apply an appropriate process to the domain. Now, I haven't gone into detail about other options for different domains because frankly that's outside the scope of this series, but you can easily find information about them online. Finally, a Scrum team's skills and knowledge may create some transparency, but fundamentally they will need to experiment to find the best solution and iterate on this solution incrementally. This approach is called empiricism in a situation of complexity, and Scrum can help here.